Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Source Art Centre and Tipperary Studies, a warm welcome to you this evening. It is absolutely lovely to be back, even if we have a smaller crowd than normal. Hopefully we will be able to hold our 6 lectures and that everybody will enjoy them. This evening I would like to welcome Dr. Margaret Murphy of Carlow College, who is going to speak to us on the Knights Templar. Margaret specialises in economic and social history of medieval Ireland and has done a lot of study of the Knights Templar and their agricultural practices in Ireland. So a warm welcome to Margaret.
Thank you, Mary, for the invitation, which was issued some time ago now, but it's great to eventually make it here. I think it's over 2 years since I've actually done a public lecture, so it's particularly nice to be here, and I'm sure you'll forgive me if I'm a little bit rusty at times. The paper draws on a presentation I gave some years ago at a conference in Glenstone Abbey on the topic of the medieval military orders and their connections with Ireland. The paper was later published in a volume edited by brothers Martin Brown and Colman O'Clavey, entitled Soldiers of Christ, the Knights Hospitaller and the Knights Templar in Medieval Ireland. As well as my paper, there's lots of much better and more interesting papers in there as well. It's a long way from Tipperary to Jerusalem and to the Holy Land. In the 13th century, the journey would have taken anything from 8 to 11 weeks and longer if there were problems encountered on the way. Yet, in common with the rest of Western Europe, medieval Irish people felt a strong connection to the Holy Land, and in particular to Jerusalem. Medieval maps of the world, known as Mappa Mundi, obviously mapping the world that was known to people in medieval times, typically placed Jerusalem at the centre. So this map here on the slide, the famous Mappa Mundi from Hereford Cathedral, the map is there on the left-hand side, and you can see on the plan on the right here, this is where Jerusalem is marked here. Down here is Ireland, and then Wales, England and Scotland marked down there as well. Despite the long and dangerous journey, and this map here just showing you the typical overland route that would have been taken by pilgrims travelling to Jerusalem, might have started out with a sea journey but then mostly undertaken overland. We do know that Irish people undertook pilgrimage to Jerusalem from the 11th century onwards, while relics that were sourced in the Holy Land found their way back to Ireland. For example, the relic of the True Cross, which was gifted by Pope Paschal II to Murtoch O'Brien, and which was later donated to Holy Cross Abbey by his grandson. In 1090, Western Europe mobilized to send an army of between 60 to 100,000 men to take back control of Jerusalem from the Muslims who had occupied it for several centuries. This was the First Crusade, and the Crusaders, including some Irish, had the full backing of the church. Indeed, they were motivated by the idea, which was developed by the papacy, of a holy war. Shedding blood, taking lives, even those of women and children, was permissible, and in fact rewarded with the promise of eternal salvation. When the news of the recapture of Jerusalem reached Western Europe in 1099, there was widespread rejoicing. The Crusader kingdoms, or Outremer as they were known in the medieval period, meaning the lands beyond the sea, Those kingdoms were at their largest extent in the decades following the First Crusade, and they're shown on the map there. So it's really a coastal strip from Jerusalem and the territory around it up through Tripoli, Antioch, and then the county of Edessa, this large area up here. Defending these territories from almost constant attack was a huge undertaking, and gradually they started to slip away, starting with Edessa, which was retaken by the Muslims in 1144. Most devastating to Western Europe was the recapture of Jerusalem by Saladin in 1187. It's said that Pope Urban III fell down dead when messengers brought the news of the recapture of Jerusalem. For the next century and over the course of several crusades, Europe was obsessed with defending the small number of Christian strongholds that remained in the East and with regaining control of Jerusalem, something that never happened. This meant raising revenue to put mounted knights in the field, to garrison fortresses, and ensure provisioning lines to those fighting in the hostile environment of the East. The military orders were key participants in these activities. The two most important military orders were the Knights Hospitaller and the Knights Templar, and both orders started in Jerusalem. The Knights Hospitaller did not start as a military order. Their initial role was to look after pilgrims in their hospital, or more correctly, guest house, really. It wasn't a hospital that offered medical treatment, in their hospital of St. John in Jerusalem. But they later became involved in military activities. The Knights Templar had a military role right from the start. In the immediate aftermath of the First Crusade, they were formed to keep the roads to Jerusalem safe for pilgrims, but as time went on, they played a leading role in the defense of the Crusader states in the Holy Land. They built castles, they garrisoned important towns, they participated in battles, fielding significant contingents against Muslim armies until the fall of Acre, which was the last remaining Crusader stronghold in the Holy Land. And that happened in 1291. The Templar rule was based on the Benedictine rule and also influenced by the Cistercians. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. But unlike monks, they were not cloistered. Their main duty was to fight. If there's any fans of J.R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones books or the HBO series in the audience, you might recognize that the Knights Templar provided some of the inspiration for the Order of the Night Watch, who also took vows of chastity and obedience and fought to defend the Seven Kingdoms in much the same way that the Knights Templar sought to hold back the forces of Islam. The Knights Templar wore a white mantle with a red cross and were to live very simply. Their original seal depicted two knights mounted on one horse, which one commentator said was emblematic of their austerity and poverty, but a more reasonable explanation is that it was symbolic of the charity and fellowship of the Templars, who would always take up a wounded knight on their horse in the midst of battle. The famous Cistercian Bernard of Clairvaux was a huge supporter of the Knights Templar, writing a treatise in praise of the order in the early 12th century, in which he rationalized the apparent contradiction of a man of God dedicated to fighting and shedding blood. So he wrote in this treatise, "A Templar knight is truly a fearless knight and secure on every side, for his soul is protected by the armour of faith, just as his body is protected by the armour of steel. The knights of Christ may safely fight the battles of their Lord, fearing neither sin if they smite the enemy, nor danger at their own death, since to inflict death or to die for Christ is no sin, but rather an abundant claim to glory. The Templars were granted many privileges by 12th century popes, which greatly increased their autonomy. They were to be free from the supervision of bishops, answering only to the Pope, and they were also exempt from the payment of many taxes and fines. Despite their emphasis on poverty, the growing popularity of the order in the 12th century meant that they attracted very significant donations of lands from the nobility of Western Europe. From the 1120s, they received land in France and Iberia, and a little later in England and Scotland. They arrived in Wales in the 1150s. The Templar Order was headed by a Grand Master who was elected for life and who served in Jerusalem. Templar territories were divided into provinces, which were governed by provincial commanders, and each individual house, which was called a preceptory, was headed by a preceptor. Their lands were developed for commercial farming, with all the profits going to support knights fighting in the Holy Land. Supplies, especially horses, were transported to the Holy Land. The preceptories usually housed a small number of knights, frequently individuals who were no longer actively fighting because of age or illness. Land was cultivated by local labour forces. The Templars' military strength enabled them to safely collect, store and transport bullion to and from Europe and the Holy Land, and their network of treasure storehouses and their efficient transport organisation made them attractive as bankers to kings. And indeed they started to play this role for the kings of England. The first Knights Templar in Ireland came with King Henry II of England when he mounted his expedition to Ireland in 1170 to 71. Soon after this, the English king granted the order lands in the vicinity of Dublin, Waterford and Wexford. So this map here shows the Templar properties in Ireland, and we have that early grant from the 1170s, which granted Clontarf in Dublin, which became the sort of headquarters of the order in Ireland, and then this sort of cluster of lands in Wexford and Waterford, Crooken, Kilbarry and Kilclogan. We know that the Templars went on receiving grants of land in Ireland for the next 100 years. In 1270, almost 100 years after King Henry's grant, Matilda Butler granted the Templars lands in her territories up in County Louth at Kilsaran and Cooley. There's a bit of mystery, however, around when the other properties entered into Templar ownership. It's recently been suggested, actually in a paper in this volume, that the grant of the only western estate to the Templars, that's Temple House over there in County Sligo, was granted by Richard Berg sometime between 1230 and 1240. However, we have very little evidence relating to the granting of properties in Kildare, Carlow and Tipperary, although Clonulty in Tipperary was certainly one of, if not the most extensive and valuable of the Templar properties in this country. The Anglo-Normans started to settle in Tipperary in the 1180s. So this map here on the left shows the territory in Ireland that came under the control of the Anglo-Normans over the course of the 13th century. So that's all the land that's coloured in sort of orangey brown on that map, with the lands in blue remaining under the rule of Gaelic kings. Tipperary was quite quickly occupied by the Anglo-Normans, And we have early grants in Tipperary in the 1180s that were made by Henry II's son, John, famous later King John of England, who was named as Lord of Ireland in 1185. He granted lordships in Tipperary to 3 individuals: William de Burgh, Philip of Worcester, and Theobald Walter, the founder of the Butler family in Ireland. Now, it is possible that at the same time the king granted the lands at Clonulty to the Templars, or rather John. However, it's a little bit unlikely that a royal grant like that would have completely escaped notice, and that wouldn't be referenced in some of the sources, or you know, the grant wouldn't have survived. It's more likely that the grant was made by one of these noble families that were settled in Tipperary at this time. So already we'll see 2 families that were associated with later grants to the Templars, the de Burghs and the Butlers, who owned land in the area. And these men were, these families were setting up their manors in Tipperary at this time, and some of those manors are shown on this map here, which is taken from a paper by Mark Hennessy, who's done a lot of work on manors in medieval Tipperary. Clonulty I've marked on the map there with the blue cross. The closest manor to Clonulty is Ardmail. Hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And it seems likely that there was a connection with Ardmail. The Templars actually owned the advowson of the parish church of Ardmail, which meant they could appoint the rector of that church, and they were entitled to the tithes coming into that church. So it was common to grant Templars advowsons of churches as well as lands. So it's possible that it was the Lord of Ardmail who granted the land at Clonulty to the Templars. But that doesn't really narrow things down enough for us, because the manor of Ardmail passed through various different ownerships. In 1207 it was held by Walter de Lacy, and then it passed by marriage to Richard de Burgh in 1225, and then by marriage again to the Butlers in 1240. So any one of these families could potentially have granted the land at Clonulty to the Templars. So that's a bit of a mystery to us, which, you know, maybe someday will be cleared up, but at the moment it is a bit of a mystery. In Ireland, the Templars were headed up by a master. So he was referred to as the master of the order, who wasn't attached to any one place but travelled around, so would have visited the various preceptories. And he was in turn subject to the master of the Templars in England. So the sort of head of the English Templars was based in London, at the Temple Church in London. So there would have been quite a lot of back and forth between Ireland and England. On the manors, the preceptors were based on the manors, and they looked after the estates, possibly also engaged in a certain amount of recruitment, and were assisted by a small number of sergeants or men-at-arms who were members of the order but weren't of the knightly class. So the knights would have all come from noble backgrounds, the sergeants not so much. On their manors, they had servants who were perhaps similar to the lay brothers who were associated with the Cistercian monasteries. They were essentially the workforce, the labourers, but it's likely that they too were, you know, in some sense members of the order. They probably did take some vows as well. While the preceptors and probably the sergeants were all Anglo-Normans, it's very likely that many of the servants, the lay brothers, were Irish. We have some evidence of this for Clonulty. In 1304-5, the Master of the Templars paid a fine for himself and his men of Clonulty. And at that point, the Master of the Templars in Ireland was also the preceptor of Clonulty. It's the first time that we see that sort of doubling up. But it does happen at that time, and it was a man called William of Warenne. So he's appearing in the justiciar rolls, paying a fine for himself and his men for some unspecified trespass or offence. But the interesting thing is that the names of the men are recorded. There's 18 of them altogether, and 15 of the names are clearly Irish. Now, some of the names are not totally legible, so there are a few sort of question marks and gaps there. But you can see there, I hope you can see, some of you in the front anyway can probably see that we have a list of names there. We have quite a few names that are clearly Irish. We have O'Kinnock there, O'Dovegir there, O'Mulryan. There's lots of O'Mulryans, more O'Kinnocks there. There's 3 names that appear to be Anglo-Norman names: Simon Bualk, James Panabesser, and Rezin Fitz, or Filia John, son of John. But 15 of the names there are clearly Irish. So that does suggest that there was involvement between the local Irish and the Templars. Chance survivals like this record aside, we actually have very little information about the Templar properties in Ireland during the 13th century. We can surmise that, in common with properties across Western Europe, they were fully exploited to provide funds and supplies for the knights fighting in the Holy Land. During the 13th century, the order suffered heavy casualties in their ongoing struggles against the Muslims, so there was a constant demand for money to replace equipment and to train new recruits. Ironically, our most detailed evidence about the Irish Templars and their property comes at the end of their history. At the time, they were suppressed. The order was actually done away with in the first decade of the 14th century. Before looking at this evidence, I want to briefly summarise the events leading to their suppression. The fall of Acre to the Muslims in 1291 removed much of the Templars' reason for being, so they no longer had a foothold in the Holy Land. There was no longer Crusader states to defend at that point. However, the Templars continued to control their great wealth and extensive land holdings in Europe, which were reckoned at 20,000 estates in 1300. So any Templars that were left probably came back to Europe, moved into their preceptories, but they didn't wish to have any of the privileges that were associated with them before removed. So they continued to guard their privileges. They continued to refuse to pay any taxation, for example, or really be treated like any of the other religious orders. And that did inspire resentment towards them, and that's possibly plays into the reasons why they were suppressed and the reasons why not enough people were prepared to defend them. It was the actions of one king, Philip IV of France, in 1307 that sealed the fate of the Templars. Philip, like most medieval kings, was chronically short of money, and for a long time he had coveted the riches of the Templars. He also had, at this particular time, unprecedented influence over the Pope. The Pope at the time was Clement V. He was not only French Pope, he came from Burgundy, but he was also living in France. So this was the time that the medieval papacy were forced to leave Rome and settle in Avignon in southern France for a period of time. So the French king really had the Pope under his thumb. Philip presented the Pope a list of crimes and abominations which were said to have been committed by the Templars. And without waiting for the Pope's reaction, in October 1307, he had every Templar in France, including the Grand Master, arrested and handed over to the Inquisition. The slide there shows the Templars, and this is showing the French king here as well. So once they were handed over to the Inquisition, that meant they could be questioned and they could be tortured. In the meantime, Philip hurried to seize control of all their properties and wealth in France. Under torture, some Templars confessed to crimes. So it was then argued that, of course, these charges were correct. So they confessed to worshipping Satan, denying Christ, spitting on the cross, engaging in carnal relations with other brothers, and so on. Even though when they were brought to trial and were asked whether they had confessed these crimes freely, even though at that point they said, no, we were tortured and made those confessions under torture, they were caught because that effectively meant that they were relapsed heretics, and thus could be punished with the ultimate punishment, which was execution. 200 of the French Templars were burned at the stake as relapsed heretics, including the Grand Master James de Molay in 1312. So he had to spend 5 years in prison being tortured and was eventually executed. The order then was officially dissolved by the Pope at the Synod of Vienna in 1311. The English King Edward II was at first reluctant to believe the charges against the Templars, but under pressure from the French king, who was actually his father-in-law, and the Pope, he caved in. And at the end of December 1307, he ordered steps to be taken to arrest all the Templars in his kingdom, including Ireland, and their property was to be seized. The Irish justiciar, when he received this command from the king, notified the sheriffs of the relevant counties that they were to be ready on the 3rd of February to take action on the king's orders. Didn't specify what for, but they were told to assemble 12 good and trustworthy men and have them available. Secrecy was paramount because there was a fear that the knights, if they got wind of this happening, that they would flee or they would hide property. So on the morning of the 3rd of February 1308, Nigel Le Brun, the king's escheator, so that's the official who's in charge of gathering revenue for the king, arrived at the preceptory in Clonulty and placed the Templars there under arrest. He then oversaw the drawing up of a detailed inventory of the goods and chattels in the property, carefully examining the buildings and the fields and recording the approximate value of what was found. All this was done in the presence of the preceptor, William of Warren. The inventories also noted rents paid by the subtenants of the manors and dues of the churches, and this information could only have been received from the Templars themselves. So it seems, that they were obliged to participate in the drawing up of these documents. They were then imprisoned, and they were a trial was held in Dublin. The Templars in Ireland or in England were not tortured, were not executed, but they were deprived of their lands and had to live out the rest of their lives on very small pensions. The survival of the inventories for the Templar properties in Ireland give us a unique snapshot of the management of their lands, as well as giving us insights into the wealth of the order. Now, the inventory for Clonulty, it's quite a long inventory. The Latin text of the inventory was printed by Herbert Wood in his 1906 paper on the Templars in Ireland, and then in 1961 Gearóid MacNicol did a full edition, a transcript, again in Latin, of all the documents that were produced around the time of the suppression, including the inventory for Clonulty. And I've just showed you there. You probably can't make that out, but that's the format of the inventory. It's basically a long list of things, each with a value attached. Looking at all of these inventories, you can immediately see that the Templar properties in Ireland were repositories of significant wealth. Taken together, the value of their possessions and rents came to well over £1,000. Most of this wealth came from agriculture, and that total of £1,000 is probably an underestimation. The Templars may have had a chance to secrete some of their possessions before the inventories were drawn up. We don't know that, but we do know that the inventories were drawn up in February, which is a time of year when most of the previous year's harvest was probably had been sold if there was surplus to sell. The other big sort of cash crop at the time was wool, so the sheep would have been shorn the previous summer, and the wool would have been sold as well. So that's why I'm saying that the values are probably an underestimation. Now, there was, of course, a wide variety in the valuations between the properties. And this slide here, which I hope you can see, shows the value in pounds. So that's pounds going up here from 50, 100, 150 to 200. And then these are the properties listed along the bottom here. And in first place there, with a total in excess of £200, is Clonulty. So that amount is made up there of the goods that were seized on the manor and valued, shown in blue, and then the brown is the value of rents that were attached to that particular place. So you can see immediately that the three sort of biggest properties were Clonulty in Tipperary, Kilclogan in Wexford on the Hook Peninsula, and Clontarf in Dublin. And then there's a cluster of properties with valuations of around £50, which is still a very respectable annual value. For context, you could note that the average yearly wage for a labourer or an artisan was in the region of £1 to £2. So a manor that was bringing in annually £50 was quite a valuable property. The products of arable agriculture were a significant element of the valuations. So the jurors estimated quantities of grain in the farmyards and also valued the manorial fields that were already sown with crops. So they walked the property and they looked at what was sown in the field, and they made a value which was based on an estimate of the crop that would be harvested later in the year. Most manors had already sown their winter wheat, so that was typically sown in around about this time of the year. And a few, including Clonulty, had already got some fields sown with oats. Now, oats were generally sown sort of later in the spring, but they appear to have been, ahead of the game, or maybe it was a particularly mild winter, but they already had fields sown with oats. So that table there shows the grain that was estimated from the different properties. It's reckoned in crannocks, which was the measurement unit that was used at the time. A crannock of wheat had 8 bushels in it, and a bushel is about, I don't know where I'm going with that because I'm not quite sure. I had a figure in my head, but I'm not quite sure of the unit there. But a crannock of oats has actually got 16 bushels in it, so it's a slightly it's a measure. It's a slightly different volume measure. But what we're interested in really is the comparison between the different properties, and you can see that Clonulty. Again, it's coming out as the main grain producer. It's growing significant quantities of both wheat and oats. Wheat is more important than oats, although there's still quite a quantity of oats being cultivated there as well. Now at Clonulty, they just seem to have been growing wheat and oats. There doesn't seem to be any evidence for them growing other crops, although some of the other preceptories were growing other crops, like barley, for example, and rye, which was fairly important down on the Wexford Manor at Kilclogan. But Clonulty is just wheat and oats. The Templar inventories recorded a range of animals on each property. Some of these animals were directly linked with arable agriculture, so they were the working animals like the oxen who pulled the ploughs, and the horses who, as well as being used for transport, supplied a range of other needs such as harrowing and ploughing. And indeed it seems that the practice on some of the Templar manors was to use a mixed plough team of both oxen and horses. So you would have typically 6 oxen and 2 horses in your team. This chart here shows the working animals on the manors, and you can see there at Clonulty. I hope that you can make these out. So this is Clonulty here. The oxen are the orangey bar, and the affers, which is the name that's used for the work horses, the horses that were used for things like ploughing and harrowing. So they're shown in blue. At Clonulty there were 20 of these horses, affers, and 58 oxen. So that's a huge number of oxen. And 7 ploughs were also recorded as being present on the manor. A team of 8 animals could plough about 120 medieval acres in a season, which might translate to about 250 to 300 statute acres. So if Clonulty was actually operating 7 plough teams, the sown arable might have been well over 800 medieval acres, and then you can double that and some to convert that to statute acres. And remember, not all of the arable was sown every year. We're not sure whether they were using a 2 or a 3 field system at Clonulty, but there probably were at least another 400 acres that were left fallow in any year. So we're talking about a very, very substantial arable operation at Clonulty. And having looked at information for several manors across Ireland, it's certainly one of the most arable orientated and the largest manors that I think was operating in Ireland in the 13th century. Another notable feature of the Clonulty inventory is the large number of horses, apart from the AFRs, the workhorses. And I've listed those there. So there were 55 horses altogether on the manor, and we had our 20 workhorses, our 20 AFRs, but there was also riding horses, pack horses, there was a stallion, there was 16 mares who were described as being in equitio, which means in the stud. So this suggests that there was a horse breeding operation going on in Clonulty, and also a number of juvenile animals as well. These horses were probably being bred to send to the Holy Land. So the horses that were bred at Clonulty were probably destined to make that long journey. That's much more horses than they would have needed to just replace their own needs. There's also quite a lot of detail given about some of the horses. So one of the horses is described as a white palfrey, and that's a really sort of quite high class riding horse. It was valued at 10 marks, which is £6, 13 shillings and 4p, which is really a huge sum of money. And another horse, which was described as having white eyes and eyebrows, which was worth 5 marks. Again, another very valuable animal. So there was obviously quite an emphasis on horse breeding in Clonulty. You'll see there that as well as the plough oxen, there were 20 cows on the manor. There was a bull, and there was some juvenile cattle as well. Again, that is partly to breed the replacement oxen, but obviously they were probably involved in some dairying, maybe cheese making as well, and obviously old animals would have been slaughtered and used as meat. The most numerous animals on the manor were sheep, so 552 sheep were present at Clonulty, and they also had 29 pigs that were kept in sties rather than being free roaming, which was more common for pigs at the time, that they were allowed to roam, particularly in woodland. This slide here just shows the livestock information across the manors. It's slightly put out of sync by the very high numbers for sheep, obviously, but there were several other manors that had over 500 sheep, and in fact one of the Kildare manors, which was situated near the Curragh, had the largest number of sheep across the Templar properties. The inventories are not concerned with listing the buildings on the manor, but they'll sometimes note where items were located. So buildings that are mentioned in the inventories include hall, chamber, chapel, kitchen, bakehouse, brewhouse, stable, grange or granary, cowhouse and pigsty. So not all of those were present were mentioned in the Clonulty inventory, but quite a few of them must have been present there. The inventories also list farming equipment, and again, this is probably not comprehensive down to every last, spade or shovel. It's probably the big items that are being mentioned and valued. Ploughs, of course, harrows, spades, hoes, billhook, used for weeding presumably, carts, wagons, One of the manors, I think it's one of the County Louth manors, had a cider press and obviously had apple orchards there. And some of the manors also had beehives, so were producing their own honey. One of the biggest questions left unanswered by the inventories is the number of knights and retainers living on each property. Only 11 Templars are specifically mentioned in the documents, although 23 appear to have been arrested. So this suggests that there was a small number of knights at each property, maybe only 2 or 3 knights. The Irish Templars, as I've said, like their English counterparts, were put to trial, but there was no use of torture and no executions. They were allowed to live out their days on small pensions. The property, however, was not returned to them, and much of it was granted out to the Knights Hospitallers and retained by them right down to the Reformation. Another big question, I suppose, is where was the Templar preceptory in Clonulty? The plan on the left here is taken from the historic environment viewer, where red dots indicate the presence of historic monuments and blue more recent historic buildings. So you will see here is marked St. John's Church. So that's Church of Ireland Church, which was built in the early 19th century, although it does contain an earlier funeral monument dating, I think, to the early 17th century. This is now a funeral home, and it's surrounded by quite a large graveyard. But interestingly, the first edition Ordnance Survey map, which I've shown down here, shows a church down to the east of the Church of Ireland Church, down here, quite near the sort of enclosure wall of the graveyard. So it's possible that that was the site of the medieval church that may have been part of the Templar property at Clonulty. There's also a holy well here, which is dedicated to St. John. And obviously, the Hospitallers did take over this property, so they would have left their mark on the area as well. Now, when I was down visiting Clonulty, I was particularly interested in this field here, which is to the north of the church. You see the church there, because it had all sorts of really interesting humps and bumps in the field. And I still think it is interesting and might repay some investigation, although there is a note in the historic environment viewer that it had previously been thought to be the remains of a medieval settlement, but more recent field walking was suggesting that these humps and bumps are of more recent creation and maybe associated with drainage or something like that, which is a little bit disappointing. But I still think it is somewhere that would repay maybe a little bit more investigation. There's very few Templar properties have been excavated. There is one property, however, in England. It's a place called South Witham in Lincolnshire, and there was a very extensive excavation of that site in the 1960s. And this is, and apologies for the quality here, this is a plan of what they found during that excavation, and they basically uncovered the entire footprint of the preceptory, which was a rectangular sort of arrangement of buildings with a sort of a courtyard in the middle, agricultural buildings like barns and cow houses down along this side, residential buildings, hall, possibly chapel on this side here. There was also a mill and fish ponds associated with this site. So that gives you some sort of an idea of the extent of some of these preceptories. And it's also interesting to note that that is the field where they found all of those remains. There's absolutely nothing surviving there above ground. It was all there underneath. So in conclusion then, what can we say about Templar agriculture in medieval Ireland and in medieval Tipperary? The farms were mixed, so there's livestock and arable going on. There's a particular emphasis, and I think Clonulty is certainly at one end of the scale of this emphasis on what's called sheep corn husbandry. So basically you are devoting a huge amount of your land to arable agriculture. You also have a large sheep flock that you are probably pasturing on the fallow arable, and you're using their dung to fertilize the fields and so on. There's obviously a lot of self-sufficiency going on, so they're providing themselves with their food, and there's things like the beehives and the cider presses and stuff like that. So there's self-sufficiency there, but there's also a very strong market orientation, because they're the wheat and wool, they're the big cash crops at the time, and that's what they're most interested in. They have some knowledge of intensive practices, so using a mixed plough team is seen as a marker of, I suppose, advanced or intensive farming at the time. On some of the manors, not at Clonulty, but on some of the manors, they are growing quite large quantities of legumes, of beans and peas, quite often growing those on the fallow. And again, that is evidence of intensivity. They know about the nitrogen fixing qualities of legumes. Rearing pigs in sties may seem like quite a normal thing to us, but it wasn't generally the practice in the medieval period. And again, that might suggest a certain amount of intensity, and also some experimentation with crop varieties. Again, not at Clonulty, which seems to have been relatively conservative, although on a huge scale, but on some of the other manors. By and large, though, there's nothing that would distinguish a Templar manor necessarily from other manors at the time in Ireland, except, as I've said, the scale of some of them. So it's not that they have any sort of secret practices or any of those things that we might assume that they're bringing sort of maybe knowledge from the East with them, or something like that. For close to 2 centuries, the Knights Templar presented itself as the shield against Islam in the Holy Land, and in doing so it funneled immense amounts of wealth from Europe into the Middle East to pay for this defence. Ireland became part of this funneling, part of this structure, if you like, in the 13th century, and was directly responsible for putting booths and horses on the ground in the distant lands of the East. The Templars would have definitely brought an exotic element to medieval Tipperary. We don't know how much interaction there was between them and the locals. It certainly seems as if there were Irish that were working on their lands, but I think we can certainly say that the locals would have felt that bit more connected to the significant events that were playing out thousands of miles away. Thank you.